Hey, I'm John. Thanks for joining me for this video today. Back in the late 90s, early 2000s, I was a real big fan of American professional wrestling. And I used to watch, I would watch SmackDown and Raw and all of those things. And, our big thing on Thursday night when SmackDown would come on would be my wife would go get some pizza and we would sit there and eat pizza and watch SmackDown, and it was goofy fun, and I really enjoyed it. After a while, I gave up watching it. I don't pay any attention to it anymore, but back then it was kind of fun. One of my favorite wrestlers was a guy who, at various times in his career, went by the name Cactus Jack and Mankind, and eventually he was just known by his real name, Mick Foley. He wasn't your typical muscle-bound, steroid-enhanced wrestler. He was just a big regular guy. I think he was 6'4", weighed around 300 pounds, long, scraggly hair, beard, missing a couple of teeth. Looked more like, a lumberjack or just a regular guy. But he was really fun to watch. He was great in the ring, and he was just fun to watch. And all of the other bits that he did, had just a great sense of humor and a wonderful way of delivering his lines. So he was absolutely one of my favorites. Now, the thing about Mick Foley, he isn't. He's no dummy. He's a really sharp guy, and he proved this by writing a couple of New York Times bestsellers about his career. The one that really just got him on the map was titled "Have a Nice Day." I think the subtitle was like "A Tale of Blood and Sweatsocks" or something like that. And it had a picture of him and his Mankind persona with this leather mask on, and he always wore a white shirt. And he just had this bit, that each wrestler has their own bit, and he had this bit that he would do that everybody recognized, and everybody loved all the various characters that he had that would, show up in his Anyway, they loved all the characters that would show up in his bits on screen. I know that was goofy. If you know Mankind, you know what that was. Anyway, he had all these characters he would do in catchphrases and all of that, and he wrote about them. And the book, if you've not read it, it's a fun read. It's absolutely a very well written, very entertaining book. So it was a lot of fun to read. Now, one of the things that he talked about in the book really interested me as a modeler. He explained in the book, he didn't make any bones about it. He admitted, we all know, it's fake. It's fake in that the outcomes are determined and things like that. When you get, thrown off of the top of a 20-foot cage, steel cage, onto an announcing table below, that's not fake. So the physicality, while they didn't try to, they were really trying to not hurt each other. There's just certain things when you get thrown off a steel cage, or you get hit with a metal chair, or you dive off of something, or somebody, throws their forearm in your face. That physicality, it's going to hurt, but the outcomes are predetermined. And, he admitted, didn't even try to hide it. Everybody knows that. But he talked about something that I found really interesting. He used the term suspension of disbelief. And what he talked about in explaining that, was that, when the audience comes in, they understand all of this. They understand the storylines are scripted. They understand that before the whole thing even starts, the wrestlers know who's going to win and who's going to lose. before they go out, they talk about, okay, when I go out, I'm going to do this, and then you're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and they kind of plan it through. And even during the match, sometimes you'll see them, if you look really careful, you'll see them communicating to each other about, two of them will lean together, and it's looking like they're doing some wrestling moves, but one of them saying, okay, I'm fixing to go over here and I'm going to throw a forearm at you, and you need to, be ready for that or whatever. But he talked about suspension of disbelief, and the way he explained it was that when people came in to watch, the wrestlers invited them into their world. They put on a show that they were essentially saying, yeah, we know that it's fake, we know that you know that it's fake, but how about for just a little while you put that aside and live in the world that it's real. You suspend your disbelief. And I thought that was a really interesting concept. Now, admittedly, it's something we do all the time. When you watch, if you watch one of the Star Wars movies, you know it's not real. You're invited into that world to look at it as if it was real. I mean, you view it almost as if it were a documentary rather than a science fiction movie. So we're very familiar with that suspension of disbelief theory, but on any wrestling show, or if you're seeing it live, it takes it to a whole nother level, And so his explanation of that made me start thinking about, how do I apply that theory to my models? If you think about it, what we do as modelers is essentially kind of the same thing, only we don't, hit our models with chairs, or generally we don't, unless they're special hobby. Anyway, we don't do the things they do, but when we're building a model, and it can be any kind of model, we're trying to get the viewer to accept that this is not necessarily a little plastic object. I mean, it's one thing to take any model of any genre and you put it together and you give it some basic paint and you set it on your shelf, and a friend comes over and they look at it and they go, you built a model. It's obvious you painted it certain colors and you glued it together, and it is a little plastic, essentially toy sitting on a shelf, and it looks cool. That's fine. But when we take those extra steps that constitute all of the weathering, the chipping, the dirt effects, the shading of the paint, all of those things we do, we're essentially trying to ask the viewer to, for just a moment, forget that what they're looking at is a little piece of plastic and actually step into the world of that object to see it as a real thing. As I thought about this more, I really started thinking, okay, I get the theory. How does that apply? How do you take that theory and how do you make it go into your models? How do you present it so that it's not just something that you think about that's kind of esoteric, it's out there, but you actually apply it to your models? And one of the things I did was I started looking at my own definition of realism and thinking about how I was trying to present models as realistic objects. We often get caught up in scale appropriateness. And I'm not knocking scale appropriateness, because if that's what you're going for, there is a time and a place for that. But quite often, when we're thinking in terms of that suspension of disbelief, we have to think about what the mind expects. And if I wouldn't have pointed in my head, you wouldn't have understood mind. But anyway, what the mind expects to see. For example, if you're building a model and you want it to have rust, Well, a human being knows what rust looks like. And so when you're trying to sell the notion of rust on a model, it has to in some way conform to the real world and what people are used to seeing with rust. But depending on the scale, sometimes if you try to do rust in scale, it may not show up on the model at all. For example, if I'm trying to do rusting effects on, let's say, a 1/100th scale gunpla model, that real, if it were real, that object is supposed to be in the real world about 60 to 65 feet tall, 18 meters. So any rust that's going to be on there is more than likely going to be small areas, maybe the size of my hand, if that. You know, if you've ever looked on a bulldozer or any piece of heavy equipment like that, a lot of the rust spots are, you know, not even the size of your thumb. They're very small. If you put something that's that scale, that size, scale appropriate, on a model that's, you know, 8 inches tall, it's not even going to be seen. You can't sell the notion of rust on something if the human who's looking at it doesn't see something that says, this is rust. And the mind knows rust is, it's orangish, it's multicolored, it may have some stains running down from it, it may have a certain texture to it. So as I thought about how to apply this suspension of disbelief theory, I started adjusting how I applied certain techniques and materials to the model so that it was deliberately exaggerated so that when someone looked at it, they would get what I was trying to sell, I guess you'd say, in terms of that particular effect on the model. Now, I know some people are going to look at, if you do exaggerated effects like that, they're going to look at it and they're going to go, well, that's not scale appropriate. Back when I built almost pretty much all aircraft, oh my goodness. I got to where I just didn't even like showing my work to other people, because I would want to do something so that the average user, the average viewer, if you put the model out in front of them, they would look at it and go, oh, wow, yeah, that's dusty and dirty and it's got some rust on it. They would see it, you know. And the guy with the low IPMS number would come along and, you know, well, that type of rust wouldn't have come from that material and not in that quantity, and those colors would have been a little different because the oxidization didn't happen at that certain latitude in 1944. And I go, dude, it's a plastic toy. I just want to sell the idea of some rust or some dirt or whatever. So it's been thinking in terms of that suspension of disbelief that has really helped me in my modeling to focus in on, what do I want the viewer to see? What emotion, what thought, what notion do I want evoked from that particular thing that they're looking at, whether it be the stain on the back of a leg of a Gundam, or a streak along a Star Wars model, or maybe some staining running down the side of a Maschinen Krieger model, or the exhaust on an aircraft. What do I want them to think? What do I want them to do when they're looking at that model? And all of those elements, when you combine them in a way that pays attention to this notion of suspension of disbelief, invites the viewer into the world of the thing, where they're no longer, you know, a full-size human person looking at a little plastic toy. Those elements, even if they're not consciously thinking it, those elements really bring them into the world that the model is in. And in essence, instead of looking down at a tiny object such as a Gundam, all of a sudden they're standing at the foot looking up and going, wow, that thing looks pretty cool. And all of this can happen simply by the way you apply your techniques to cause somebody's mind to suspend that disbelief and step into what's going on. Now, certainly, if you like doing things scale appropriate, I'm not suggesting you change the way you do your modeling. And there are times that scale appropriate if that's what you're going for. If you're trying to replicate a particular object, maybe you have a photo of a tank and you're trying to replicate that photo. Yeah, scale appropriateness and doing it even if it's not that visible unless you get right up on it, that's fine. I'm not saying don't do that, that there's not a place for that. But what I am saying is that free yourself from the thought that it always has to be that way. Free yourself from the thinking that well, if this is out of scale, it's somehow invalid. And start thinking in terms of how the average viewer is going to see it. I mean, yeah, we post our stuff on social media and other modelers look at it and they're critiquing it in their mind, whether they admit it or not. They're critiquing it for the application of technique. They're looking at, you know, almost judging it like you would for a contest. But if you just take that same model and show it to somebody who's not a modeler, model for their reaction sometime. That can be a very freeing thing. In fact, I think it's great to have some friends who you can show your models to that aren't modelers, because they're going to give you some feedback that you're not going to get from, you know, Facebook or a forum. They're going to look at it and go, oh, that's really cool. Oh, I see that, you know, it's dirty. I see the mud on it. They're going to tell you whether what you're trying to get across is being gotten across, because they're most often gonna, even unknowingly, suspend their disbelief for just a minute, step into the world of the model, and if you've presented it well, they're gonna look at it as the thing you're trying to present, and they're gonna give their feedback that way, and it's gonna help you determine, yeah, this technique that I applied or that way that I did it, that's working. It's selling the notion of rust or oil streaks or fluid leaks or damage to the model. And that's going to be some of the best feedback you're going to get. So I hope that this has given you something to think about, this idea of the suspension of disbelief. It's a concept I don't necessarily, when I'm building models, I'm not continually thinking about that, but at various stages along the way, I try to deliberately stop and look at it and say, okay, how do I see this if I'm drawn into the world of this object? You know, we did it as a kid all the time. I mean, kids suspend their disbelief continually. I remember when I was a kid, me and a friend could climb up in this pine tree in my front yard, and I would sit on one limb and he would sit on the other. And it could be anything from, you know, flying a World War II bomber to controlling the Starship Enterprise to, you know, being in the Millennium Falcon or navigating a submarine through, you know, underneath the Arctic Ocean or something. And the whole time we were just sitting in a tree. But, you know, kids do that. They're perfectly okay with that suspension of disbelief. I mean, I think we just call it make-believe, you know? But take that notion and apply it to your work and see if it doesn't give you some additional enjoyment, some freedom in the hobby, because you're not so worried about, is this accurate, but does this sell the thing I'm trying to get across? Thank you so much for watching this video. I'm really appreciative of that. And if you're following me on social media, there's a bunch of links below, and I appreciate you following me there. If you're not, pick your favorite service and give me a like or a follow or a subscribe or whatever is particular to the service of your choice. And there's a subscribe button at the bottom of just below this video. If you would click on that and maybe click the little bell icon so that you'll know when I have new videos out, I would appreciate that greatly. I'm trying to grow the channel, so your help in that way is most appreciated. And finally, there is a link to a Patreon page that I have, which helps support me in the hobby. It keeps me going where I otherwise wouldn't be able to do this to the degree that I do it with the materials and the videos and everything else that I do. So Patreon is what makes that happen. And if you're already a Patreon supporter, thank you so much for doing that. I'm really grateful for your support, especially during a time like this when every dollar counts. So it's not lost on me how much of dedication you guys have to me, and I appreciate that. I guess a final thought I'll leave you with is, if you're not having fun in this hobby, you're doing it wrong. And as Mick Foley would say, have a nice day. And as I say, happy day to you, friends. Bye-bye.